it's going to be okay. And I think that especially when people go through traumatic situations, obviously I deal with veterans a lot, law enforcement, and the whole PTSD that people have been going through and talking about for the last, well, I guess since the wars have been on, last 20 years. And a lot of times someone would go through traumatic experience and they'd have bad feelings about it. They'd have regrets about it. They'd have things that they wish they would have done differently. And one of the main themes I was telling people during this tour was that's totally normal and it's okay. It's okay to think, oh, I lost some friends and sometimes I feel sad about it. Well, yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's normal. That's fine. In fact, if you weren't sad about it, there may be something wrong. Because I think that people have been told for a while that, oh, if you're feeling sad, there's something wrong with you. When I actually don't think there's anything wrong with when you feel sad. You feel sad? Yeah, you lost friends. You're going to feel sad. Oh, you were in combat. You had to do some horrible things. You did some things that you regret. There's nothing wrong with that. People make mistakes. Things don't turn out the way that they wanted them to. We made decisions and there was a bad result at the end of that decision. And instead of thinking, oh, I'm a terrible person, no, it's like you made a mistake and that's okay and you got to move on.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, I think, with regards to, say, post-traumatic stress disorder or regret. You know, because it's one thing if you're sad because you've lost people. It's another thing if you're blaming yourself because you believe, and maybe with some cause, that you've made a mistake. And often people don't know what to do about the fact that they've made a mistake. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit, because some of the people who are watching and listening will have made mistakes, and some of them are hanging themselves out to dry because of it, right? I mean, especially if you make mistakes that have had fairly dramatic consequences. So, and this ties in, I would say, also to the motif of forgiveness, because there's not much difference between forgiving other people and forgiving yourself. And you can't just do that by saying that you're going to do it. So what I've observed clinically, and I think this works philosophically as well, is that what you want to do to set things right, which is to atone, is to lay out what you've done that you think was wrong. Provide yourself with the best possible defense. So, you know, there's a reason in our legal system that we start with the presumption of innocence, which is a miracle. Because like tyrannies start with the presumption of guilt. And the reason they do that is because everyone's done something wrong. And if you dig around enough in anyone's life, you'll find a reason that they're culpable, a reason to put them away. And so the fact that we presume innocence is a complete bloody miracle. And I can't figure out how we ever managed to get that right. But you got to do that with yourself. So imagine you're taking yourself to task because you did some things wrong. It's like, okay, list them out in your imagination or write it down. But then you got to defend yourself as thoroughly as you possibly can, which doesn't mean you're trying to get yourself off the hook. It means that you're trying not to take yourself apart more than is necessary. And then you might ask, well, if I've done something terrible, maybe what's necessary is that I commit suicide, is that like I pay the ultimate price for my sins. And people will do that when they're depressed. And that's not right, because actually what you want to do to atone is to set yourself back on the right track. So the precondition for forgiving yourself is, first of all, to sort out whether or not you're accusing yourself too viciously, like a tyrant. But then let's assume that there's some leftover evidence, compelling evidence that you did do something wrong. Okay, now you have to figure out what you did wrong, and you have to figure out what you would have done differently and what you will do differently in the future. And then my sense is, and I think this works out psychologically, is that if you can set yourself up so that you've learned from the mistake you made so you wouldn't repeat it, then you get to go on with your life. And I think that's also what you do with people around you. You know, I mean, you might want to forgive someone maybe who hurt you when you were young, for example, because you don't want to carry that burden around. You know, it's like, it's been 20 years, you're still mad about it. It's like, well, you got tortured, plus you're still angry about it, so that's not good for you. But to forgive someone so that you can heal a relationship means that they have to confess what they did, they have to assess why it was wrong, they have to come up with an alternative way of behaving, and then they have to swear, by all that's holy, so to speak, that they're not going to do that again in the future. And then I think, and you might say that the devil in your mind that's still accusing you might say, well, what you did is so terrible that you should never be let off the hook. And I would say to that is that if that's the criteria that you use for judgment, then everyone's doomed, because everyone makes mistakes in their lives. And I would say probably everybody makes unforgivable mistakes. And so if we're going to take ourselves apart about that permanently, then we're all ruined.
Yeah, I was pretty lucky growing up in the military that I would get to see guys, and I was probably 26 years old, and I moved into like an instructor role in the SEAL teams. And so you'd see these young leaders, and they'd go out on some training mission, and they were going to mess things up. They're going to make mistakes. And, you always get this talk about, well, you made the best decision you could with the information that you had at the time. And it kind of sounds like a cop-out in a way, but it's actually not a cop-out at all. You make the best decision that you can with the information that you have at the time. Like, what more can a human being do than make the best decision they can with the information that they had at the time? And when you get more information, or when the results come as they may, that decision that you made might not have been a good decision. It might have been a bad decision. But there's number one, there's nothing you can do to change it. Like, it already happened. You made the decision. And then I would always look at the guys and say, what was their intent behind this decision that they made? Like, why did they do that? Because if we can decipher that, and their intent was they wanted to make a good move to get their guys out of a bad situation, what more could I want from a leader than to make a decision that's doing their best with the information that they had at the time to maneuver out of a bad scenario to take care of their guys? There's nothing more I could hope for. So as long as I think you peel back the onion and you kind of review what happened, you say, oh yeah, I made the decision at this time. Of course, if I had this other information, I change it, but I did what I did. The result was not what I wanted. It's not what I intended. Here we are. And now you can either beat yourself up, or you can say, here's some lessons I've learned from it. And the first book that I wrote was called Extreme Ownership. The opening chapter of that was a fratricide that took place where I was the guy in charge, where one of my SEALs killed a friendly Iraqi soldier in a terrible situation. And of course, we could go back, and the hindsight's 20/20, and I could have done this, and I should have done this, and I should have done something else. And I didn't. And that's on me. And so I think, that initial part, if we're going to talk about forgiveness, the first part of that is taking ownership, to say, yep, this was my call. This was my decision. This is the move that I made. That's me. Mm-hmm. It's not anybody else, it's me. Mm-hmm. Because the minute you start saying, well, this person did that, and this person, the enemy did this, and we didn't expect that. The minute you start casting blame on other people, now I think you're lying to yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to cause more problems. So saying, yes, this was a decision I made. This is the information I had at the time. It ended up being a bad decision. Here was my intent behind it, and I've got to move forward. If you want to, I always talk about, you want to learn, but you don't want to dwell. Yeah, if you dwell on the past, if you dwell on the mistakes that you made, like you said, everybody is just doomed.